Today, I continue to work with a 1953 straight razor manufactured in Moscow at the STIZ factory. And the more I work with it, the more I realize it's not just an old tool, but something that exists today, something that has undergone change and survived time. When I first picked it up, it looked practically hopeless. A thick layer of rust completely obscured the metal surface. I felt like restoring it was impossible, or at least very difficult. But there's always one thing about restoration. You never quite know what's underneath the corrosion. Sometimes the rust reveals damaged metal, and sometimes it's a nearly perfect base that simply needs to be properly secured. In this case, I was lucky. Beneath the rust was a fairly high-quality blade, and that immediately made me realize the razor was worth restoring. But to understand the value of these things, you need to delve a little deeper into history. In the 1950s, the STIZ plant in Moscow was one of the key manufacturers of sharp tools. Its full name derives from the Soviet industrial system, where each plant had a distinct specialization. In those years, the country was actively rebuilding itself after the war, and much attention was paid to practical household tools. Straight razors weren't rare or collectible back then. They were common, everyday tools. They were used everywhere, at home, in barbershops, and in workshops. Electric razors existed, but they hadn't yet become widespread, so the classic straight razor remained the mainstay for shaving. That's why strict quality standards are placed on such products. The razor had to be sharp, strong, and reliable. High-quality carbon steel was used for this purpose. This material produces excellent results, but it also requires maintenance, as it can easily deteriorate. If such a razor is left uncared for, it will quickly begin to rust. And this is most likely what happened to this particular example. It had simply been sitting unattended somewhere, perhaps in a drawer, a garage, or a workshop, without oil, without protection, exposed to moisture and time. But the most interesting thing is that even in this state, it retained its core. When such razors were produced at the STIZ factory, the process involved several stages. First, a blank was formed, then mechanically processed, followed by grinding and finishing. But the important thing is that the final sharpening was often done by hand. This demonstrates that each razor can have subtle differences, its own character, its own geometry, its own individuality. The blade was usually stamped with the mark STIZ Moscow, 1953. This is more than just a marking. It is a sign of quality and proof of origin. These hallmarks make items of interest to collectors, as they allow them to accurately determine their age and place of manufacture. If you think about it, this razor has already endured a long time. It was made during the USSR's active industrial development, when such a thing had to be functional and durable, and this razor is an example of just that. It was most likely used by an ordinary person. Perhaps it was the owner, a barber, or simply someone who used it regularly. Then, as often happens, it fell into disuse, was forgotten, and simply lay there, battered. And now, more than 70 years later, it's back in use. When I began repairing it, the first step was removing the rust. This is always the most unpredictable moment, because it's then that you really see what remains of the metal. In this case, the result was better than expected. The metal was preserved quite well, despite the severe corrosion. This speaks volumes about the quality of the steel and the fact that the razor was truly made for longevity. Next comes the polishing stage. This is where the true history of the object begins to be created. Over time, the finer grains fade, revealing the original shape of the blade, just as it was intended at the factory. Each stage of polishing is like peeling back a layer of time. First, rough finishing, then finer finishing, and finally, a nearly mirror-like surface. This is a very slow process that requires patience. Sometimes it seems like nothing is changing, but in fact, changes are constantly occurring. They just take time to become prominent. Only when you move to a finer grit do you begin to see how the metal begins to come alive. After this, polishing begins. This is the stage where the razor looks completely different. I used GOI paste and felt wheels. This is where that very shine that makes the metal visually live appears. But even at this stage, it's important not to rush. Overheating the metal or improper pressure can ruin the entire result. The surface eventually becomes smooth and reflective, and it's hard to believe it was once a rusty object. But for me, the most important part of this process isn't just the appearance. It's the fact that this object is brought back to life. And now, after all the processing steps, the razor looks completely different. It has regained its tool-like form, not just an old piece of metal. But that's not the end of it, because a razor must not only look good, but also perform its primary function, be sharp. And the most important step remains, sharpening. And that's where we'll determine whether this razor has been fully restored.